pleasure and honor on behalf of the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies and the Sally and Ralph Duchin Memorial Lectureship Series to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture. Joining us in making this lecture possible are several co-sponsors whose generous and enthusiastic support we deeply appreciate. Now, I was thinking of giving you a coat with all the logos of these institutions on it, and then I thought you would look just like one of those race car drivers, you know, with all the things. Today's speaker, Russian-American journalist and author Masha Gessen, was born in Russia and first came to the United States as a teenager. She returned to Russia for a few years, but due to conditions there, especially related to governmental opposition, she and her family eventually immigrated here to the States. As many of you will already know, her work has garnered international acclaim in the area of LGBT rights, but she's also famous for her trenchant critique of Mr. Putin, a topic on which she will speak this evening at the JCC at 7 o'clock, and you're all warmly invited to that event. She has been a Nieman Fellow in journalism at Harvard and is the author of 9 books on a range of topics related to LGBT rights, Russian Jewish culture, and Russian feminist studies. Most pertinent to this afternoon's lecture is her book, Words Will Break Cement, The Passion of Pussy Riot. I might add that she's also currently working on a biography of the Boston Marathon bombers, Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, and is actively engaged, actually taking a break from the trial today to be here. I'll note that her books are on sale here after the lecture. You're certainly encouraged to buy some and perhaps also be willing to sign some of those books for you. Her lecture this afternoon is entitled, What Is It About the Gays? Please join me in warmly welcoming to the U of A, Masha Gessen.
Thank you. Wow, by my count, I've only written 7 books, but I think you're counting some I don't count. But I'll take it.
It's a promotion.
It's an advance. So I'll talk about the Kremlin's anti-gay campaign, which actually is obviously related to the book that I wrote about Pussy Riot, which is called Words Will Break Cement. And one way in which it's related is that Pussy Riot, unlike me, knew that the Kremlin was focusing on LGBT people much earlier than many other people did. It was a very accurate and incredibly perceptive reading of Kremlin policy that I think has gone largely underappreciated. But, you know, when Pussy Riot, everybody knows who Pussy Riot are, right? Yeah? Okay, but most of you probably think it's a punk band, which it's not. It's actually a protest art collective, which used the persona of a punk band as one of its characters, just one. But they became particularly famous for this persona. And this persona of this punk band, this character, performed protest songs in various Moscow venues, usually in order to record a series of performances of the same song and then put them on video. And so the one that made them really famous was the one where they went into the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which is the largest cathedral, the most gaudy cathedral, the most corruptly constructed cathedral. It was constructed by, the money for its construction was collected by shaking down businessmen in Moscow. So they went into the cathedral on February 21st, 2012, and sang a song in which the refrain was, Mother of God, chase Putin out. And the song, it was a protest against the symbiosis of church and state. The protest happened 2 weeks before Putin's so-called re-election, a sort of ritual in which some people go to the polls, and then the Kremlin reports whatever it wants to report about the election results. But even though the election could be rigged, Putin, who was faced with a protest movement, was feeling very nervous about the election and was as Russian dictators always do, reaching for the help of the church in the lead up to the election. And the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church was very actively campaigning for Putin, was comparing him to God in a very unsubtle sort of part of the campaign, and also had parish priests tell parishioners that Russian Orthodox believers do not go to protests, and so they can't go to protests. So this very clear meddling of the church in electoral affairs, right? And I'm purposefully not saying this this lack of separation of church and state, because there's never been a separation of church and state in Russia. But this really clear meddling by the church in this particular aspect of electoral life, this is what Pussy Riot were protesting on February 21st, 2012. And the reason that they got arrested and the reason that they were sentenced to 2 years in prison, and those of them who were identified, because the principle of Pussy Riot is that it's an anonymous art collective, an anonymous open membership art collective. So anybody can put on a balaclava and call themselves Pussy Riot. But the 3 women who were unmasked and identified and put on trial were all sentenced to 2 years in prison, which at the time was the first instance of somebody in Russia being sentenced to years in jail for peaceful protest. And if you think about it, this happened less than 3 years ago. And, being sentenced to years in protest seems so old hat now. It happens in Russia all the time. But that was the first time. They were really sort of, in that sense, also, I think, prescient. They told us what was about to happen. And in focusing on the symbiosis of church and state, and in pointing to the issues that the church was affecting in their song, and what they mentioned was LGBT rights. One of the lines in the song was LGBT rights are going to Siberia in shackles. And focusing on women's rights in the song, Pussy Riot were really pointing to exactly what was what sort of the point of conflict was going to be in Russian society for the next several years. Now, what I had really missed was that several months before that, the Kremlin had launched a major concerted anti-gay campaign. It was a propaganda campaign on television. It was also a legislative campaign. I was aware of the legislative campaign. I wasn't completely clueless. I was a political journalist. But it had started in 2006 with the passage of a ban on so-called homosexual propaganda in a small town far outside of Moscow, not that far, but outside of Moscow, called Ryazan. And then, and at the time it seemed like a curiosity. It seemed like, to me actually, having spent my adolescence in this country, and having become a gay activist in this country, and a journalist for the gay press in the 80s, it seemed really quaint to me. It seemed like they'd read about Anita Bryant somewhere, and were like engaging in some sort of some weird bit of nostalgia and trivia by passing this law in Ryazan. And then they passed more similar legislation in ever larger towns and cities, so in Kostroma, and then in Novosibirsk, and then in St. Petersburg. And by the time it got to St. Petersburg, I was getting nervous. I wasn't completely clueless. And in the meantime, someone had challenged the constitutionality of the bill as it was originally passed in Ryazan. And the Russian Constitutional Court, and the challenge was that, first of all, the word propaganda is not defined in law, so you don't know what's punishable. And gay propaganda, what homosexual propaganda is, or propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations, as they were phrasing it, can't tell what that is either. So what are you banning? It can't be constitutional if you can't define in law what you're banning. The Constitutional Court handed down a resolution that included an explanation of what propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations is. And it said that propaganda is the concerted and unregulated distribution of information that can cause harm to the physical or spiritual development of children including forming in them the erroneous impression of the social equality of traditional and non-traditional sexual relations. That is really scary, because that was actually new for Russia. Russia had passed many random laws, designed for random enforcement, for selective enforcement, but it had not yet passed a law that actually created second-class citizenship, right? This law said it is illegal to claim social equality. So if I didn't tell my children that they were worse than the neighbor's children, or that we were worse parents than the neighbor's parents, then I was conceivably in violation of this law. So by the time the law got to St. Petersburg, I started paying attention. And that happened less than a month after the Pussy Riot action, which also happened to be less than a month after our third kid was born. Because that happened on the same day, February 21st, 2012. My girlfriend gave birth to our third child, and Pussy Riot had the action in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which guarantees that I will never forget either date. Because actually I remember how I learned of the Pussy Riot action, because I was, my girlfriend was in labor, and I was sitting there by her side, and I'd never been in that position before. Our oldest child was adopted, and I'd had the second one, so I didn't realize how long it took, and how sort of inactive you are when you're just company. So I was trying to work. I was looking at the news. I was looking at I did some editing. I tried to get her interested in watching a movie. And then this at 11 o'clock in the morning, this item came across the wires that Pussy Riot staged a protest in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, and I thought, this is so great. So this is so great, isn't this great? No interest. So this was a couple of weeks later, and after we picked up the baby after we left the hospital with the baby, it very quickly turned out that, and our older kids were older, so it turned out that our cars were actually both of our cars were too small for a stroller. So we had to trade up, and then I was coming home from work, and I was listening to the news, and the law had passed in St. Petersburg. And I came home and I said, you know what, are we buying new cars, or are we just getting the hell out? Because this is not looking good. And she said, no, that's ridiculous. We're staying put. That can't be real. She was breastfeeding, and all those wonderful hormones, I think, were making us a little overly optimistic. So we went and got two new cars that could fit the stroller, and I started working actively to prevent the passage of the law on the federal level. And that's when I realized the scale of the catastrophe, that the propaganda campaign had been going on for a while, that there had been debates on television. We didn't watch television, so we didn't realize that state television was having debates on whether the measures that the state was taking were sufficient to keep the homosexual threat at bay. The question on one of the talk shows was, is it enough to ban homosexual propaganda? That was the question for debate. So, the sort of the pro-gay position is, yes, it's enough. And the anti-gay position is, no, it's not enough, we need to do more. So, in his opening statement in that talk show, this is April 2012, one of the leaders of the state broadcasting monopoly, who has since been appointed the head of Russia Today, the big propaganda monolith, he said, it is not enough to ban gay propaganda. We also need to ban blood and sperm donations by gays. And if they die in car accidents, we need to bury their hearts underground, for they're unsuitable for the aiding of anyone's life. So this was war. This was a concerted effort to make the enemy seem less than human, both, monstrously dangerous and less than human at the same time, which is classic. They certainly weren't the first people to be doing it, and they weren't the first people to be doing it with the gays either. But why the gays? Right? I think that part of the reason was coincidence. Right? It was a good minority. I mean, you always have to target a minority in times of crisis, and the gays seemed to be a good minority. The Jews had backfired back in the 70s. And by this point, Russia was sort of wise to the fact that if you go after the Jews, the world takes notice. It didn't occur to them that the world would take notice if they went after the gays. And it's quite evident that every time after the world did take notice, which took a while, but after the world did take notice, every time that Putin would be traveling abroad and faced with questions about the anti-gay campaign, he felt ambushed. Like, why do you care? The exact same question that the Soviet leaders used to ask about the Jews in the 1970s. So in some ways they never learned, but at least they thought that it was a good minority that could be targeted. There are many ethnic minorities in Russia that are targeted and can be targeted and could be made enemy number one. But the problem with ethnic minorities is that you can't really whip up a lot of fervor because they're systematically discriminated against in Russia. So it's hard to make people feel like they're in danger of being taken over by people who they know are oppressed and discriminated against. With the gays, it was different, because the gays, in addition to being being a perfect minority, were also a perfect symbol of the West. The way that works was that the Kremlin could say to people, look, there were no gays and lesbians in Russia before the Soviet Union collapsed. Well, you laugh, but actually there were no gays and lesbians in Russia before the Soviet Union collapsed. There were people who loved people of the same sex. There were people who formed all kinds of relationships. But there were no people who identified as gay or lesbian and as members of a group that could be seen as gay or lesbian, and as members of a group that had the same rights as everybody else and that could fight for its rights. That had never happened until the Soviet Union collapsed. It was a very clear example of something that came in at a particular point from the West. And so when Putin tried gay baiting the protesters, which is part of how it began, part of it was he was sincere. When he saw the protesters, what he saw, and I'm talking about the mass protests that he was faced with in the winter of 2011, spring 2012. When he looked out at the protesters, he really did see the enemy. He saw people protesting not just his regime, but the state itself, because he's forgotten the difference between his regime and the state itself. And if people were protesting the state itself, then they were anti-Russian. If they were anti-Russian, then they had to be foreigners, outsiders, or at least agents of the West, which is why when Putin first talked about the protests, he blamed Hillary Clinton personally for inciting the protests.
She's such an out lesbian.
Well, then he thought about it some more, and then he realized it was Hillary Clinton and the Kremlin did take notice of this. Was the first highly placed U.S. official to make LGBT rights a matter of clearly an agenda priority agenda item, and a matter of international conversation. So, and that I'll actually talk about that more tonight, about how that works into the new ideology. But that's the little grains of truth are very, very useful. And of course, the third thing that made gays so perfect a minority to target was that people had never talked about sexuality in public in Russia. It had never been a matter of public conversation, because when the Western world was having the sexual revolution, we had the Soviet Union. So the moment the Kremlin started talking about matters of sexuality, it owned the conversation. There was no language even in which to object. There was no language in which to say something else. And one of the ways in which this language issue actually goes really, really deep. One of the ways in which it manifests is that after the anti-gay campaign began, everybody wanted to know, well, is there public support for this or not? not actually meaningful question to ask in the conditions of an authoritarian country, right? But still, there are polling organizations in Russia, and they try to do their job, and some of them are actually, bona fide. Well, one of them is a bona fide research organization that really tries to do its job, honestly. So many of you have probably, if you've been following this, a couple of years ago heard about a poll that showed that I think 73% of people, or 82% of people, I can't remember exactly, support the homosexual propaganda ban. Well, actually, that poll was leaked from this organization, and the organization, the company called the Levada Group, had decided not to release it, because when they started polling people, they realized that they didn't have a neutral language in which to ask people their opinions, even of these laws, right? So they got their preliminary results, and they decided to scrap them, and then the secretary leaked the results to the press. Then they fired the secretary, and the secretary went to work for the ruling party. So, then they decided to try to redo the poll, and they actually brought me in as a consultant to try to construct the language. And we sat there for like 2 days trying to phrase these sentences, and basically they gave up. The state owned the conversation. There was no way to say, if you, what do we say? If you say LGBT, people don't understand what you're talking about. If you say non-traditional sexual relations, that's so heavily marked by legislation. I mean, how can you ask people about something that's already been outlawed, right? If you ask about sexual minorities, the word minority is also so loaded in Russia that, again, it wasn't working. So I tried a few different phrasings and gave up. And that points to the absolute impossibility of having a conversation about this. And the final thing that made it very easy to focus on gays and lesbians and other, vaguely defined non-traditional sexually non-traditional relationship people was that, and again, I'll talk about this more tonight about how this works in the ideology, but family had always been a contested sphere in the Soviet Union. Well, while the party line remained constant on many things, right? You could only think one thing about Lenin forever, starting in 1917. But you were always supposed to think different things about private life. That space was constantly changing. And so people were very attuned to what the state has to say about how they're supposed to behave in private, how they're supposed to construct their family relationships. Because it's a matter of survival in an authoritarian or totalitarian society to know what the state has to tell you about things that are contested. Because, after the revolution, the marriage was abolished, and then it was reestablished, and then divorce was outlawed, and then abortion was outlawed, and then abortion was legalized, and then the state put great effort into legitimizing children born out of wedlock in order to get the birth rates up. And then there was this great liberalization in the early 90s that had to do with all sort of everything that has to do with the private sphere. And then there was a growing sort of conservatism in the aughts. And so you always had to keep your eye on this moving target. And so people were very, very sensitive to what they were being told by the state. So it became clear that we weren't going to beat back the effort to pass this legislation on the federal level, and in addition, the race for the biggest homophobe in Parliament began, because it became the most popular political issue. It became a way of winning points with the ruling party. So various politicians started competing for what else they could outlaw. So the head of the committee on family and children said that they were going to create a mechanism for removing children from same-sex families. They one of the big proponents of the anti-gay laws from St. Petersburg, who had sort of ambitions of becoming a federal level politician, gave an interview to the biggest tabloid in the country, Komsomolskaya Pravda, in which he said, what the Americans want is to adopt our children and bring them up in perverted families like Masha Gessen's. And this happened actually almost a year to the date of the passage of the St. Petersburg law and our getting new cars. And I wrote a letter to, our oldest son is adopted, so I wrote a letter to an adoption lawyer I knew, asking him if I was overreacting or if this seemed like a warning that the state was about to come after my kid. And he said, the answer to your question is at the airport. And then he said, it's probably not going to happen right away. It is entirely conceivable because Russia has this incredible legal tool called the annulment of an adoption, which is a civil procedure, and it is different from revoking parental rights or removing a child from a family. So in Russia, in the civil procedure, if somebody doesn't, one of the parties doesn't show up, the court can go ahead. And a lot of the time people find out that there are judgments against them without ever knowing that there was a case against them. I knew this as a journalist because this was always happening to journalists. They would find out that there were libel cases or defamation cases against them, that they were never notified that the courts were hearing. So I knew this could happen, and they said, yeah, and the court could hear a case on the annulment of adoption in your absence, and there could be a judgment to remove your kid from the family at any time. So, while you're still here, or while he is still here, make sure that you tell him if he's approached by any strangers, he should run in the opposite direction. And then we'll know, we need to look for a judgment, and then we can appeal it. We'll try telling a 14-year-old to run in the opposite direction if he's approached to strangers. And anyway, it's not a way you can bring up a kid. So, so we got him into a boarding school in the States, and he left. And then it became clear that we had to leave as well. And in June 2013, the Parliament passed the law against homosexual propaganda in its final reading. And it also passed a second law banning adoptions by same-sex couples or single people from countries where same-sex marriage is legal. And this is a law that could be applied retroactively. And it promised to create a mechanism for removing biological children from same-sex families. And so that that's when we sort of started packing our bags and just selling our cars, and we left. The thing about legislation is that legislation, again, in an authoritarian society, especially one that is rapidly becoming a totalitarian society, functions quite differently than it does in other kinds of countries. A lot of the time people ask me, well, how many times has the ban, on homosexual propaganda been applied? It's been applied, and it's been applied to, to really awful ends. Like most recently, it was used against a website or an online community called Children 404. 404 is the error message that you get when a web page doesn't exist, and this was basically the point of the name of this community is that these are children who are supposed to not exist, LGBT teenagers. It's the most incredible online community. It existed. It came into existence right around the time that the anti-gay campaign intensified, so a little less than 2 years ago, and it was publishing dozens of letters, at some point dozens of letters a day from LGBT teenagers. It really became an outlet for them to find each other, to talk to somebody who's in the same situation. The stories were just heartbreaking. I mean, very, very rarely was there just a sweet story. Most of the time there were stories of people getting kicked out of their houses, kicked out of school, bullied at school, correctively raped, forced into marriages by their parents, etc. So, and actually there's a documentary called Children of 404 about this community. that is available. I think it's available online, but it's showing around the country. It's a really good documentary. The two directors who made it got 45 kids from that community to talk to them, and they got several of them to actually wear cameras to school and film their being bullied. It's horrifying. I mean, but it's also it's the rare occasion of an important documentary that is also really well made, and it was crowdfunded in Russia. So it's called Children 404. So the online community Children 404 it had charges of homosexual propaganda brought against it. It won a couple of times, and then it lost. So it's now access to it is blocked, and they have to pay a huge fine for supposedly engaging in homosexual propaganda to minors. Now, interestingly, because nobody actually writes on this community except for other minors. So basically what they're doing is they're claiming that minors are engaging in homosexual propaganda to minors. Right? So the subject of the crime is also a minor, which makes no sense. But there are very few egregious cases of this legislation being applied. But legislation in a society like that serves as a message. It's part of the propaganda campaign. It's a sign that the state is taking this seriously. And what the state is taking seriously is that it has identified this particular social group as its enemy number one. And so that is a call to action. It is a call to action to state actors, right? So social services have been going after LGBT families with children, even though they haven't yet passed legislation. So far they've tabled the legislation that would create mechanisms for removing biological children from same-sex families, but social services are going after them anyway. For example, there's a case outside of Moscow, two men who had twins with a surrogate, and social services went, everything, surrogacy is perfectly legal in Russia. There's actually quite a lot of it because a lot of people from Western Europe, where surrogacy is not as readily available, come to Russia to take advantage of legal surrogacy. So everything was done by the book, and then social services tracked down the woman and either blackmailed her or bribed her into filing suit against these men. So they were going to remove the child and the children, the twins, the 18-month-old twins, and place them with their biological mother. The men went into hiding and then fled to the United States. Fortunately, with their, and they're lovely. They came with one of their mothers who helps them take care of the babies, and they're all living in Brighton Beach now. You can't make this stuff up. Another family outside of Moscow, also in a small town, but just outside of Moscow. And this was the first family that I was aware of that they went after. Two women, both of them have 7-year-old children. At the time they had 7-year-old children, now they're 9 years old. 7-year-old children from previous marriages to men. Everything very amicable. Both of the married couples had been friends, then the women hooked up. Everybody is friends. The two women give love advice to one of the ex-husbands. I mean, to the point of you're going to meet this woman that you've been corresponding with for the first time. You cannot take your old washed out underwear with you. You have to pack nice new underwear in your suitcase, because one of them, not his ex-wife, was packing his suitcase for him. So then social services enter into an agreement with one of the ex-husbands to go after one of the sons, and social services file a brief saying that the boy will be irrevocably harmed by being brought up by two women. A 15-page brief that talks about psychological harm. They managed to settle, to get the guy, because he had been a friend, withdraw the suit. But it was already in court. It was, they had a hearing scheduled, and they'd had a pretrial hearing. So this is a signal for every state agency that can have a stake in it to start acting even before legislation has been passed, because that's a way to demonstrate loyalty. Even bigger, it's a signal for non-state actors. It's a signal, it's a call to violence, because if these people are less than human, if they're contaminated, if they're also dangerous, then as a patriot of your country, you should be beating them up at every opportunity. And so we see murders. There was a murder in Volgograd in May 2013. From what we know, from the testimony, this is the testimony of the murderers. Right? What they said is that an old friend of theirs, somebody that they'd grown up in the same building with, and used to sit out on the bench drinking beer with, he told them he was gay. It offended their patriotic feelings. And so they stripped him, raped him with a beer bottle, and then crushed his skull. It's a murder, and they actually got arrested, and they actually testified. But people do not get arrested for beatings. Some of these beatings take place in broad daylight. On the day that the Parliament, on June 11th, 2013, when the Parliament passed the law against homosexual propaganda in its final reading, there was a small protest in front of Parliament. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the very center of Moscow, and just a dozen people are staging a kiss in front of Parliament. I went there. I parked my bike nearby. As I was walking to the entrance when I felt something really heavy land on my back, turned around. It was the self-proclaimed leader of the so-called Russian Orthodox movement. He had something heavy in he had a shoulder bag, he had something heavy in his bag, and he was just beating me with it. And you could see he was so happy that he personally got to beat me personally up. The place is swarming with police. And, and I'm trying to draw their attention. I'm saying, I'm getting beaten up here. 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And finally, I felt somebody grab me by the arm and pull me into this little tiny crowd of people who were protesting, which is what got me out of the beating. Then we got pretty well roughed up as we were being hauled off by the police. And as we were saying, why are you hauling us off? This is after, the baggies of urine and feces, had been thrown at us. And why are you hauling us off? Why don't you go after them? You see, they're actually engaging in violent acts against us. And the police say, we're hauling you off for your own safety. And you know what they were? I mean, it would have been a lot safer if they'd hauled them off. But there were 300 of them and a dozen of us. But there were a couple of kids, and they were all kids except for me. I mean, they were all like 20 or under. The couple of kids were left behind. They were chased down Moscow's Central Avenue by these thugs and beaten to within an inch of their lives. And all of that was caught on camera. And no one has been prosecuted. And again, this is broad daylight on a weekday in a major metropolitan city. So this sort of thing happens all the time. The politician I mentioned who gave the interview to the daily newspaper mentioning my family, when there was a queer festival in St. Petersburg this past fall, actually led a pogrom of the queer festival. So he led a group of thugs who broke in and started roughing people up, again for the cameras, right? So in addition to this for the cameras violence, there's also vigilante violence, and there's random violence. And I'll get, I won't go into detail because basically all of it is equally bloody and horrifying. But just one small illustration. I have a friend who owns a cafe in central Moscow. And at some point they actually felt compelled to put up signs saying, gay bashings will not be tolerated in this cafe. Put up a sign saying gay bashings will not be tolerated in this cafe because they'd gotten tired of breaking up fights. because it had become a thing, to go in and rough people up in cafes in Moscow. People who happen to look gay or to look like hipsters or to look different than whoever is doing the beating up thinks they should look. So one last thing I want to say about actually two last things I want to say about the anti-gay campaign. One is you probably haven't heard a lot about it recently, right? And you might get the impression that Russia is too busy waging war in Ukraine to keep going after the gays. That's a really interesting issue because Russia is not too busy waging war in Ukraine to be going after the gays. In fact, if you watch Russian television, what you will learn is that part of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, in fact, the most important thing Russia is doing in Ukraine, is saving the world from the encroachment of gay culture from the West and fighting American homo-fascists in Ukraine. The reason you don't hear very much about it, I think, is fascinating, which is that it's really difficult for a sane person or a self-respecting journalist to write something like that, because who's going to believe you? And how can you, with a straight face, report that? And again, I'll talk more about that tonight, about the sort of the built-in absurdities of totalitarian ideology, which is actually not unusual. And Hannah Arendt writes about that particular feature of totalitarian ideology that makes it very, very difficult to tell its story. But that's also happening with Russia, with the anti-gay campaign, which is very much alive, both in Russia and in Ukraine, and very much a driving force of Russia's foreign policy, including the war in Ukraine. And the last thing I want to say before I take a couple of questions is that obviously that's resulted in a huge outflow of LGBT people from Russia. And that's something that this country is seeing, that we're seeing a lot in New York. I was very lucky. I had a U.S. passport. I'd lived in this country before. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled on the Windsor case just as we were deciding to leave the country, so we were just able to get married and get my partner a green card. It was a very soft landing. Most people are coming here on tourist visas, seeking asylum, living here for at least a year with no means, no right to seek work, no nothing. That's very, very difficult. Some people have already ended up homeless, and still people keep coming. Immigration Equality, which is the large LGBT organization that helps asylum seekers, first of all, it can't keep up with demand. Second of all, the bulk of its cases is now Russian speakers, and they now have one full-time Russian speaker on staff, and still they can't keep up with the number of cases. And think about how far the United States is for people to keep coming here, and how desperate people have to be. But the really bad thing about the fact that people don't have any way to survive for the first year is that it's much easier, it's still very, very hard, but it's much easier for single people or younger couples to come than for people who really need to get out as soon as possible, which is families with children. So mostly we're seeing people with children come when things get really desperate, like with those guys who had to go into hiding before fleeing. But most people, would not be able to go into hiding in that situation and flee. Most people it would be too late. And so we need to figure out ways to get people over here and to keep them afloat for at least a year so that families with children can get out of the country and people who are already here don't end up homeless. Thank you. And we have 10 minutes for questions.